During World War II, snipers played a key role on many battlefields. Hidden amongst the rubble of bombed-out cities and armed with powerful weapons, they could often hold up the advances of entire units.
The role of the sniper has always captivated the public's imagination. The precision of their shots, along with the patience and composure required to hunt their target, elevate these figures to legendary status, admired by both their allies and their enemies. The Eastern Front of World War II, which saw horrific battles between the Soviets and the Germans, had a particular aspect in this regard. In desperation against the Nazi advance, the Red Army decided to allow women to replace the fallen soldiers, and many did so by becoming snipers. They soon proved they had nothing to envy from their male counterparts. Thus, they became heroines to their citizens and nightmares for the invaders.
Snipers had the ability to change the course of history with one shot, one kill.
That's why today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about the 3 most well-known Soviet snipers of World War II. Before this conflict broke out, the personnel of the Red Army of the Soviet Union were no different from those of other countries of the time. Men were the only ones tasked with fighting on the front lines. Women, if allowed to enlist in the armed forces, served in support roles such as nurses, radio operators, drivers, and administrative staff. If they reached a combat role, it was only as crew members of anti-aircraft weapons, defending their territory from enemy planes. However, in mid-1941, a significant event occurred that would change the mindset of military leaders. On June 22nd, Germany launched a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. This mobilization caught Joseph Stalin off guard, as he had ignored reports from his spies that something was being plotted at the border between the two countries. The Nazis overwhelmed the disorganized Russian defenses, destroying their tanks and planes by the thousands, and killing countless soldiers and civilians. Within a few months, hundreds of kilometers of Soviet territory were under their control, including major cities like Kiev and Minsk. Other key centers of the Union, such as Leningrad and Moscow, were in imminent danger of falling into their hands. The German offensive lost momentum by late 1941, as winter complicated the advance of their forces. Stalin and his top military leaders took advantage of this moment and considered certain measures to prevent their collapse. One of these measures was the redirection of industrial resources to support the war effort and the relocation of factories to the interior of the country to prevent them from falling into Nazi hands. To sabotage the invaders' actions, partisan groups consisting of civilians and some soldiers were formed to operate behind enemy lines, but something needed to be done to replace the horrifying number of casualties sustained in those months. At the beginning of the German attack, a large number of women sought to join the armed forces to defend the Union, but were turned away. Now, with a clearer understanding of the threat posed by the Nazis, this was reconsidered. As a result, they were trained in various military branches. For example, 3 air regiments were created consisting solely of female personnel. Thus, the Soviet Union became the first country to allow women to fly combat missions. One of the most well-known of these groups was the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, nicknamed the Night Witches by their enemies.
И мы знали, что немцы называли нас ночными ведьмами. Нам мы не возражали. Конечно, мы ночные ведьмы были. Да ясно.
The Night Witches maneuver through a dangerous situation. The slow and flimsy PO-2 lacks protective armor, so the women must strike silently, using stealth tactics and the element of surprise.
When they were close to their aim point, they would switch off their engines and glide in silently to drop the bomb.
Women also took on other roles where they gained fame and prestige, such as tank crews and infantry divisions. Among these, the most celebrated combatants of the Red Army emerged from infantry divisions. In addition to those who fought on the front lines, a highly sought-after position was that of sniper. Partly this was because, generally, their smaller bodies made them harder for the enemy to detect. This size advantage also meant they required less food during the hours or even days they had to remain in the same position, waiting for their prey. One of the most famous of these skilled combatants was Nina Lobkovskaya. Born in 1924 in what is now Kazakhstan, she was 17 years old when, in 1942, her father was called to join the Red Army. Soon after, she received the terrible news that he had been killed in action. Eager to avenge him and defend her country, she enlisted as a sniper later that year. By then, the German advance had significantly slowed, mainly due to the Battle of Stalingrad. The Soviets could afford to train their new recruits before sending them to the front lines. Nina underwent a rigorous course where she trained for her role, learning to dig and move between trenches, camouflage herself with her surroundings, and shoot moving targets. By mid-1943, she had successfully graduated and was sent to the conflict. She initially fought on the Kalinin front, where the Russians had been facing off against the Nazis since the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, who aimed to reach Moscow. It was here that she killed her first enemy. Later, she was tasked with training other snipers, and after fulfilling this mission, she was transferred to divisions fighting near the Baltic states. It was on this front where, according to her own account, she faced her worst battles. Although by this point the Germans were being slowly driven out of Soviet territory, they still maintained a significant presence in the north. The fighting against the invaders there was bloody and exhausting, with waves of enemies that seemed endless. On one occasion, Lobkovskaya had to set aside her sniper rifle and pick up a flamethrower to halt a Nazi attack. Despite the large number of casualties, the Soviet line held firm, and they managed to repel the Germans. By 1944, Nina was already a platoon commander. Despite sustaining several injuries during the fighting, she was part of the armies that drove the Germans out of the Baltic region, Belarus, and Poland. She was even present at the impressive liberation of Warsaw in December of that year, after which she and her comrades traveled 400 kilometers in 2 weeks, chasing the Germans.
Naturally, it's too soon to receive Russian newsreels of the new offensive. Moreover, when the Red Army broke through in the south, it moved at such a pace that progress must be reported hourly to be up to date. The advance towards Silesia at an early stage covered about 100 miles in 3 days. Then came the news of the outflanking breakthrough north and south of the Polish capital and its liberation.
In 1945, the last year of the war, she held the rank of lieutenant and was the leader of a sniper company that saw combat near the German-Polish border. The only reason Nina did not make it to Berlin was because her division was ordered to be withdrawn from the front, and they were instead given support roles. After the war, she turned to history, graduating from Moscow University. Her life from this time on is shrouded in mystery. No one knows the date of her death, for example. Also, as she was not a figure raised by propaganda like other cases we will see later, the exact number of confirmed casualties is also unknown. However, the high number of personal medals received leaves no doubt that she was a top-level fighter. She was awarded the Medal for Combat Service, the Medal of Valor, the Order of Glory, 3rd Class, the Order of the Patriotic War, 2nd Class and 2 1st Class orders, and the Order of the Red Banner. Another famous Soviet sniper was Rosa Shanina. She was born in 1924 in the small Russian village of Yedma. During 1941 and 1942, while studying at university, 3 of her brothers were killed in combat against the Germans. After this, Shanina did not hesitate for a second to enlist in the Red Army. While waiting for her application to be accepted, she began training with a rifle. She was eventually allowed to join the Central School of Female Sniper Training, from which she graduated with honors. Despite being under 20 years old, she was even offered a position as an instructor. However, Shanina wanted to go to the front lines. She would get her chance in early 1944, where she was immediately chosen as the commander of a sniper platoon. 3 days later, she took out her first enemy. Just 2 weeks after arriving at the front lines, she received her first medal for her actions in the Smolensk province. These included killing 13 enemies while artillery exploded around her, and she was subjected to machine gun fire. It didn't take long for Soviet propaganda to start using her image to inspire both soldiers and civilians alike. We can now hear some of the feats accomplished by Shanina.
During one engagement, around 50 Germans got into the trench containing Shanina and 11 female snipers. The fighting was hand-to-hand, with rifles, bayonets, grenades and shovels all used. The snipers won, even taking a few prisoners. She and her unit were heavily involved in the battle for Vilnius. During intense daily operations, Shanina disposed of a German sniper, outwitting him and other opponents with great fieldcraft and skill.
During the liberation of previously conquered territory, snipers were often granted permission to withdraw from the front or even ordered to stay behind. This was the case for Shanina during Operation Bagration in June 1944, which aimed to drive the Germans out of Belarus. But the young woman flatly refused to stay out of the fight. Disobeying her superiors and risking a court-martial, she grabbed her rifle and headed into combat. This happened more than once, even going so far as to write to Joseph Stalin on 2 separate occasions to request permission. Although she was reprimanded for her defiance, the punishment was not severe, as the army needed her effectiveness. The Soviet forces continued advancing throughout that year, reaching East Prussia. By December, Shanina had already accumulated over 50 confirmed kills and numerous medals, but it was here that she would see her final combat. By January 1945, the Germans had significantly reinforced their defenses, and the fighting between the two sides was fierce. Despite Soviet efforts, the enemy held out and even counterattacked. By the end of the month, of the 78 soldiers in Shanina's platoon, 72 had been killed. She herself wrote in her personal diary that she felt her end was near. On January 27th, a brutal artillery assault struck the sniper's position. According to witnesses, one of her comrades had been injured, and while the young woman was protecting his body, a shell fragment hit her chest. She was quickly rushed to a hospital, but despite the medical staff's efforts to save her, she succumbed the following day. Posthumously, Shanina was honored as a heroine, with streets and museums named after her. Although she was always lauded by the press, she remained constantly humble. In her diary, she wrote, "What have I really done? No more than what I should as a Soviet, having risen to defend the homeland." At the time of her death, Rosa Shanina was a senior sergeant and had been awarded 2 Orders of Glory and a Medal for Valor. She is credited with 59 kills. The last case we'll discuss in this video, and perhaps the most well-known, is that of Lyudmila Pavlichenko. Born in 1926 in Ukraine, she had already begun practicing marksmanship in her teens. As a university student, she had also taken sniper courses. However, Lyudmila's intention was not to join the armed forces. She wanted to be a history teacher. At 25, just before finishing her degree, the German invasion began. She did not hesitate and immediately went to the Soviet recruitment offices. The recruiters refused to accept her, and when she persisted, they offered her a position as a nurse. But when she showed all her marksmanship training, they agreed to take her on as a sniper. However, she had to wait for her opportunity to showcase her skills. Due to a shortage of equipment, she was assigned to dig trenches in the Ukrainian province of Odessa, with only a hand grenade as her weapon. Her luck changed in August 1941, when an injured comrade gave her his Mosin Nagant rifle. There, her legend began, as she killed 2 German officers in one day at a distance of 400 meters. Odessa was besieged primarily by Romanian forces, one of the Nazi allies, although elements of the German army also assisted them. The confrontation lasted nearly 2.5 months. During this time, Lyudmila was constantly engaged in battles against the enemy. Due to her skill and composure in carrying out her mission, she was quickly promoted to sergeant. Despite her efforts, those of her comrades, and those of the civilian population, by October, the Axis forces had the Soviets cornered. By the time they were forced to abandon the province, Lyudmila had 187 confirmed kills. But her legend did not end there. After the fall of Odessa, her division was transported to Sevastopol. This city was the only part of the Crimean Peninsula still not in Axis hands. After a bloody battle that did not achieve the desired results, the Germans and their allies once again resorted to a siege. This time it was much more prolonged, lasting 8 long and grueling months. But while Soviet defenses slowly fell and supplies dwindled, Lyudmila continued with her mission. More than 100 enemies were added to her extensive list of victims during this time. Thanks to her excellent performance, she was also put in charge of training new snipers who joined her in leading the Nazis to their deaths. During this period, she not only made a name for herself among her allies, but also with her enemies.
German intelligence learned who she was. They even made radio broadcasts offering her money, rank, and favored treatment if she defected, as tens of thousands of Ukrainians already had. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was wounded 4 times by shrapnel and once by a machine gun bullet. But she never wavered, and after each wounding and recovery, she returned and continued doing her job.
During her time in Sevastopol, Lyudmila met the young Alexei Kitsenko, who shared her role in the Red Army. Shortly afterward, they married. However, this rare moment of happiness on the battlefield was cruelly brief. Just a few weeks later, Alexei was wounded by a mortar shell and died a few days later in the field hospital. Lyudmila had no time to mourn his death, as the Germans continued advancing. The invaders realized that a Soviet sniper was taking them out one by one, so they resorted to their own snipers to find her. According to sources, in one particularly long duel, Lyudmila and her rival pursued each other for 3 entire days, until she finally delivered the fatal shot. But unfortunately, her luck ran out. In June 1942, just days before Sevastopol fell, shrapnel from a mortar wounded her in the face. By then, the Soviet propaganda department had already heard of her legend, so the High Command ordered her evacuation from the city. They recognized her value as a symbol of Red Army courage and did not want her life to be at risk. She was even dubbed Lady Death. Lyudmila recovered from her injuries but did not return to the front. Instead, she was promoted to lieutenant and sent to countries like Canada and the United States on publicity tours. Her goal was to persuade Western allies to open a second front against Germany. She even became the first Soviet person to stay in the White House as a guest of President Roosevelt. Below, we can hear part of the inspiring speech she gave on American soil.
Я хочу сказать вам, что мы победим, что нет такой силы, которая могла бы помешать победоносному маршу свободных народов мира. Мы должны объединиться. Как русский солдат, я предлагаю вам, великим солдатам Америки, свою руку. Fellow soldiers, forward to victory.
After her tour, she continued training snipers until the end of the war. Lyudmila Pavlichenko is credited with 309 kills, of which 36 were enemy snipers. Some sources suggest that the actual number of her kills might have been higher, as a third party is needed to officially confirm each death. Others claim that her legend is an exaggeration by Soviet propaganda and that she may not have performed many of the feats attributed to her. This last point might have some truth, as all countries engaged in such practices. Nonetheless, it cannot be denied that regardless of the true number of kills, Lyudmila was one of the most successful snipers of World War II. In addition to numerous campaign medals, she was awarded 2 combat service medals, 2 Orders of Lenin, and the honorary title of Hero of the Soviet Union. The 3 women we discussed are perhaps the most well-known, but they are far from the only ones. It is believed that around 2,500 women enlisted as snipers during World War II. Collectively, their credited kills exceed 11,000. However, most of them did not return home. Approximately only 1/5 survived until the fall of Nazism. Their impact, both on the battlefield and on the morale of the Red Army and the Soviet people, cannot be overlooked. We've reached the end of the video, and we'd like to ask you, do you know of any other famous female snipers? Don't forget to leave your answer in the comments section, and subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.